Most of us know the traditional advice for protecting our heart: exercise regularly, maintain a healthy weight, don't smoke, keep your blood pressure under control, pay attention to your diet and cholesterol. But there is another part of cardiovascular health that we don't always give the same attention to, and that's sleep. And it may not simply be about how many hours you get. Research suggests that both getting enough sleep and maintaining a reasonably consistent sleeping pattern may be important for the health of your cardiovascular system. So, in this video, we are going to look at two studies that approached this question in very different ways. The first was a randomized controlled experiment where researchers deliberately restricted the sleep of healthy adults and measured what happened in their blood pressure, blood vessels, and nervous system. The second followed more than 86,000 people and investigated whether irregular sleep duration was associated with the risk of heart attacks and strokes. And importantly, we are going to separate what these studies actually demonstrate from what they don't. Because if we want to know how best to sleep to protect our heart, we need to understand what the evidence can genuinely tell us. If you're new to the channel, I'm Leon Figures, and this is Health Figures, where we take health, fitness and longevity research and break it down into information that's simple, practical and easy to understand. And if you've been following the sleep series, this is video 6 of 8, where we're looking at the science behind sleep and the different ways it can affect our health. If you find this video useful, please give it a like, share it with somebody who might benefit from it, and subscribe to the channel for more evidence-based health, fitness and longevity content. So let's get into the research. Can the way you sleep affect the health of your heart? Let's look at it. The first study we are going to look at was published in the journal Hypertension in 2021 and was conducted by researchers from the Mayo Clinic led by Naima Korvasin. The researchers wanted to investigate what happens to cardiovascular function when healthy people are deliberately deprived of sleep. This is an important distinction because a lot of research looking at sleep and cardiovascular disease is observational. An observational study may find that people who regularly sleep less are more likely to develop high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease, but that does not necessarily prove that insufficient sleep causes the problem. People who sleep less may differ in numerous other ways. They may have different diets, different levels of physical activity, higher levels of stress, different working patterns, or other health conditions that could influence cardiovascular risk. So in this study, rather than simply observing people's normal sleeping habits, the researchers experimentally restricted their sleep. And they used what is known as a randomized crossover design. A randomized crossover study means that the same participants experience both experimental conditions, with the order of those conditions randomly assigned. This is useful because each participant effectively acts as their own control. Instead of comparing one group of people who sleep normally with a completely different group of people who are sleep deprived, researchers can compare what happens to the same person's cardiovascular system under both conditions. The study involved 20 healthy adults who completed both experimental phases. The participants were young, generally healthy, and had normal blood pressure, which is important when we eventually consider how widely we can apply the findings. The participants completed an inpatient laboratory protocol, meaning they actually stayed in the research facility where the sleeping schedules and physiological measurements could be carefully controlled. In the controlled condition, participants were given a 9-hour opportunity to sleep each night. In the research restricted condition, the opportunity was reduced to just 4 hours per night. The experimental sleep schedules were maintained for 9 nights. The researchers then measured different markers for cardiovascular function. One of the most important was blood pressure. Blood pressure is the force created as circulating blood pushes against the walls of your arteries. You will normally see blood pressure expressed as two numbers. The first is a systolic blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure means the pressure in your arteries when your heart contracts and pumps blood around your body. The second is diastolic blood pressure. That measures the pressure in the arteries when the heart relaxes between beats. Persistently elevated blood pressure matters because over time it places additional strain on the heart and blood vessels and is a major risk for cardiovascular disease. But the researchers did not simply take one blood pressure measurement in the laboratory. They used ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. Ambulatory blood pressure monitoring involves wearing a portable device that repeatedly measures pressure as someone goes through the day and night. This allows researchers to examine changes across an entire 24-hour period rather than relying on a single measurement taken at a particular moment. The researchers were particularly interested in what happened to blood pressure when participants were sleeping. Normally, blood pressure falls during sleep. This is sometimes referred to as nocturnal dipping. Your cardiovascular system therefore normally experiences a period during the night when blood pressure is lower than it is during waking hours. And this is where the sleep restriction experiment produced an important result. When participants were restricted to 4 hours in bed, their nighttime blood pressure increased compared with the controlled sleep condition. In other words, restricting sleep interfered with the normal reduction in blood pressure that occurs during sleep. The researchers also found increases in 24-hour blood pressure with sleep restriction, with some of the effects differing between men and women. But blood pressure was not the only thing they measured. The researchers also examined endothelial function. The endothelium is a thin layer of cells lining the inside of your blood vessels. It plays an important role in regulating whether blood vessels constrict or dilate, meaning whether they become narrower or wider. Healthy blood vessels need to be able to dilate appropriately when tissues require increased blood flow. To investigate this, the researchers measured something called flow-mediated dilation, or FMD. FMD is a non-invasive test used to assess how effectively an artery expands in response to increased blood flow. Put simply, it provides researchers with an indication of how well the lining of the blood vessel is functioning. After sleep restriction, FMD was reduced. This suggests restricting sleep impaired the ability of participants' blood vessels to dilate normally. The researchers also measured norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is a chemical messenger involved in the systematic nervous system. The systematic nervous system is a part of the body's automatic nervous system that helps prepare us for activity or stress. Among other things, increased sympathetic activity can increase the heart rate, constrict blood vessels, and influence blood pressure. Sleep restriction increased plasma norepinephrine levels during sleep periods. So after restricting sleep, the researchers were seeing changes across several parts of the cardiovascular system. Blood pressure increased. Normal nighttime blood pressure patterns were disrupted. Blood vessel functions deteriorated. And norepinephrine increased, providing evidence of changes in nervous system activity involved in cardiovascular regulation. There was another particularly interesting part of the experiment. After the period of sleep restriction, participants were allowed recovery sleep. But some of the cardiovascular effects did not immediately return to their original levels. This is important because it challenges a very common assumption about insufficient sleep, that you can repeatedly restrict your sleep and simply repair everything with 1 or 2 opportunities to sleep longer afterwards. This study does not prove that recovery sleep can never reverse the effects of sleep restriction, but it does show that under these experimental conditions, recovery was not necessarily immediate for every cardiovascular measure. There were also important limitations. The study was relatively small, with only 20 participants competing both experimental conditions. The participants were also predominantly young and healthy. That means we should not automatically assume that the magnitude of these effects would be identical in older adults or people who already have hypertension or cardiovascular disease. The sleep restriction was also substantial. 4 hours in bed per night is considerably less sleep than many people experiencing more moderate sleep restriction would normally get. So this study cannot tell us that somebody sleeping 6 or 7 hours rather than 8 or 9 would necessarily experience exactly the same changes. And 9 nights is still a relatively short experimental period compared with the years or decades over which cardiovascular disease normally develops. The researchers were measuring short-term changes in cardiovascular physiology, not whether these participants eventually suffered heart attacks or strokes. That distinction is crucial. We cannot take this study and say that 9 nights of restricted sleep causes cardiovascular disease. What we can say is that experimentally restricting sleep in healthy adults produced measurable changes in several physiological systems involved in cardiovascular health, and that makes the findings particularly interesting. These were not people who already had diagnosed hypertension or cardiovascular disease. They were healthy adults. Yet, when their opportunity to sleep was substantially restricted, their cardiovascular system began behaving differently. Their blood pressure increased. Their normal nighttime blood pressure regulation was disturbed. Their blood vessels became less effective at dilating, and markers of symptomatic nervous system activity increased. So when we think about insufficient sleep, the consequences may extend to considerably further than simply feeling tired the following morning. Even while you're laying in bed, your cardiovascular system may be responding to the sleep you did not get. The second study we are going to look at was published in the Journal of American Heart Association in 2025 and was conducted by researchers led by Tianyi Huang. The study approached the relationship between sleep and cardiovascular health from a different direction. In the first study, researchers deliberately restricted people's sleep and then measured what happened to their cardiovascular system over a relatively short period of time. This second study looked at what happens in the real world. More specifically, the researchers wanted to investigate whether irregular sleep duration from one night to another was associated with a greater risk of experiencing major cardiovascular events in the future. And rather than simply asking people how long they normally slept, the researchers objectively measured their sleep. The study included 86,219 participants from the UK Biobank who were free from cardiovascular disease when their sleep was measured between 2013 and 2015. The UK Biobank is a large research database containing health and lifestyle information from hundreds of thousands of people in the United Kingdom. Researchers can use this information and link it with health records investigating how different behaviours and biological characteristics are associated with diseases over time. Each participant wore an accelerometer continuously for 7 days. An accelerometer is a small electronic device that measures movement. The technology is found in devices such as fitness trackers and smartwatches, and researchers can use the movement patterns it records to estimate when somebody is sleeping and how long they sleep. This is an important strength of the study. Many large sleep studies rely on self-reported sleep. In other words, researchers ask participants questions such as, how many hours do you normally sleep? But people do not necessarily know exactly how long they sleep each night. Using an accelerometer allowed researchers to obtain an objective measurement of the participants' sleep patterns rather than relying entirely on their memory or perception. But the researchers were not primarily interested in whether somebody slept for 6, 7, or 8 hours. They were interested in how that person's sleep duration changed from one night to another. To measure this, they calculated the standard deviation of each participant's sleep duration across 7 days. Standard deviation is a statistical measurement of how much a set of values varies around its average. In this study, A lower standard deviation means somebody's sleep duration remained relatively consistent from night to night. A higher standard deviation meant their sleep duration fluctuated considerably more. For example, someone who regularly sleeps approximately 7 hours every night would have relatively low sleep duration variability. Someone who sleeps 5 hours one night, 8 hours the next, 6 hours the following night would have a much greater variability. The researchers then followed the participants through linked hospital records until May 31st, 2022. This type of research is known as a prospective study. A prospective study identifies and measures characteristics of participants and then follows them forward through time to see who subsequently develops the outcome researchers are interested in. In this case, the outcome was a major cardiovascular disease. The researchers defined a major cardiovascular event as either fatal or non-fatal myocardial infarction or a stroke. A myocardial infarction is the medical term for a heart attack. It occurs when blood supply to part of the heart muscle becomes severely reduced or blocked, potentially damaging or killing heart tissue. A stroke occurs when the blood supply to part of the brain is interrupted, or, depending on the type of stroke, when a blood vessel in the brain ruptures. Across 636,258 person years of follow-up, the researchers documented 2,310 major cardiovascular events. Person years are a way of expressing the total amount of follow-up time contributed by everybody in the study. One person followed for 1 year contributes 1 person year. 100 people followed for 10 years will contribute to approximately 1,000 person years. Among the cardiovascular events recorded in this study, there were 1,183 myocardial infarctions and 1,175 strokes. The researchers then examined whether greater variation in sleep duration was associated with the likelihood of experiencing these cardiovascular events, and they found that it was. After adjusting for socio-demographic factors and family history of cardiovascular disease, every additional 1 hour increase in standard deviation of sleep duration was associated with a 19% higher hazard of experiencing a major cardiovascular event. For myocardial infarction specifically, the increased hazard was 23%, and for stroke, it was 17%. It is important to understand exactly what these numbers mean. The researchers reported hazard ratios. A hazard ratio compares the rate at which an event occurs between different levels of exposure over the period being studied. A hazard ratio of 1 would indicate no difference in the rate of event. A hazard ratio above 1 indicates a higher rate. So a hazard ratio of 1.19 for major cardiovascular diseases corresponds to a 19% higher relative hazard association with each additional 1 hour increase in the standard deviation of sleep duration. That does not mean someone's absolute probability of having a heart attack or a stroke suddenly increased by 19 percentage points. Relative risk and absolute risk are not the same thing. The researchers also attempted to account for other factors that might help explain that relationship. They performed additional statistical adjustments of lifestyle factors, existing medical conditions, and other sleep-related factors. After these adjustments, the association becomes somewhat weaker, but they were not eliminated. This is important because people with irregular sleeping patterns may differ from people with regular sleeping patterns in many ways. They may have different working schedules, levels of physical activity, diet, health conditions, or other behaviours that could independently influence cardiovascular risk. Statistical adjustments attempts to account for some of these differences, but it cannot guarantee that every possible difference between groups has been removed. The researchers also investigated whether genetic susceptibility to cardiovascular disease changed that relationship. Interestingly, greater sleep irregularity was associated with higher cardiovascular risk regardless of participants' genetic risk of cardiovascular disease. They also found that the association appeared to be stronger among people whose average sleep duration was greater than 8 hours. But there is a crucial distinction we need to make with this study. Unlike the first study, this was not a randomized controlled experiment. The researchers did not randomly assign 86,000 people to regular or irregular sleeping schedules and then wait to see who suffered heart attacks and strokes. They observed people's existing sleep patterns and followed their subsequent health outcomes. That means this study can demonstrate an association. It cannot, by itself, prove causation. We cannot conclude from this research that irregular sleep directly caused the cardiovascular events. It is possible that other characteristics associated with irregular sleep contributed to the increased cardiovascular risk. It is also possible that underlying health problems could influence both somebody's sleeping patterns and their future cardiovascular health. There are other limitations worth considering. Sleep was objectively measured, which is a major strength, but it was measured for only 7 days. Those 7 days may not perfectly represent somebody's sleeping habits over years. And because the participants came from the UK Biobank, they are not necessarily representative of the entire population. But despite those limitations, the study provides an interesting complement to the controlled experiment we were looking at earlier. The first study demonstrated that experimentally restricting sleep can produce measurable changes in blood pressure, blood vessel function, and symptomatic nervous system activity. This second study followed more than 86,000 people and found that greater night-to-night variation in objectively measured sleep duration was associated with a greater subsequent risk of major cardiovascular events, including heart attacks and strokes. So when we talk about sleep and cardiovascular health, the evidence raises 2 separate questions. How much sleep are you getting? And how consistently is that sleep from one night to the next? Because sleep may not simply be about accumulating a certain number of hours. The regularity of those hours may matter as well. What can we take away from these 2 studies? The first study gives us evidence from a controlled experiment. Researchers deliberately restricted healthy adults to just 4 hours in bed per night and observed measurable changes in their cardiovascular system. Blood pressure increased, including during sleep. The normal reduction in blood pressure that should occur overnight was disrupted. The ability of the blood vessels to dilate was impaired. And the levels of norepinephrine increased, suggesting greater activity from the symptomatic nervous system. Importantly, these changes occurred in healthy adults over a relatively short period of sleep restriction. But this study does not tell us that a few nights of poor sleep will give you cardiovascular disease. It shows us something more specific. Insufficient sleep can directly affect physiological processes involved in cardiovascular health. The second study approached the question from a completely different direction. Instead of deliberately restricting sleep in a laboratory, researchers objectively measured the sleep patterns of more than 86,000 people and then followed their cardiovascular outcomes over time. They found that greater variation in sleep duration from one night to another was associated with a higher subsequent risk of cardiovascular events. Each additional 1 hour increase in the standard deviation of sleep duration was associated with a 19% higher hazard of major cardiovascular disease and a 23% higher hazard of myocardial infarction and a 17% higher hazard of stroke after adjustment for socio-demographic factors and family history. Those associations became somewhat weaker after researchers accounted for additional lifestyle, medical, and sleep-related factors, but they remained. However, because this was an observational study, we cannot say that irregular sleep caused those heart attacks and strokes, and that distinction matters. When we put the 2 studies together, they provide 2 different pieces of the same puzzle. The controlled experiment provides evidence that substantial sleep restriction can alter cardiovascular physiology. The large prospective study shows that irregular sleep duration is associated with cardiovascular events occurring years later. Neither study on its own proves that one particular sleeping pattern will cause an individual to develop cardiovascular disease, but together They challenge the idea that sleep is simply passive downtime with little relevance to the heart and blood vessels. Your cardiovascular system continues to be regulated throughout the night. Your blood pressure should normally fall. Your blood vessels still need to function effectively. And the nervous system controlling cardiovascular activity does not simply switch off when you go to bed. So when we talk about protecting cardiovascular health, we normally think about the obvious factors: exercise, body weight, diet, smoking, blood pressure and cholesterol. Those things absolutely matter, but the evidence we have looked at suggests that sleep belongs in that conversation as well. And there may be two important aspects to consider: getting sufficient sleep and getting that sleep with a reasonable degree of consistency. We should not take these studies to claim that sleeping perfectly every night will prevent cardiovascular disease. The science does not allow us to say that. But we can say that sleep restriction can negatively affect cardiovascular function, and irregular sleep patterns have been associated with a greater risk of serious cardiovascular events. So sleep is not simply about whether you feel tired tomorrow morning. Whilst you sleep, your cardiovascular system is working, and the quantity and consistency of that sleep may influence how well it continues to work over the long term. You get one body, fuel it properly.